So this is a male, and it is Het for desert ghost, but is it spot nose? Can I use this guy in my project? How am I going to use him? What's best to pair him with? Hi guys, it's Rob from Raw Balls. So we're going to look at some of the genetics behind working with a recessive project and how Hets work, what we use them for, and project plans moving forward. You can see that clutch 2 has now all gone into shed. They're looking mighty grubby, very milky coloured, and you can see the eyes have gone milky. But this is the clutch with 4 bright coloured leopards that we were hoping were also spot nose, and the whole of this clutch is of course Het for desert ghost. It is looking more and more like we do not have what we needed from this clutch. So we'll come back and take a look when they've shed, but in the meantime let's take a look at a recessive project, in this case using Desert Ghost, and we'll take a look at Hets, how you use them, why we make them, how they work, and the difference that this is going to make to this Desert Ghost project. Let's see if we can engineer our way out of a result that does not live up to our expectations. So this guy here is the male for the project. He is a visual Desert Ghost, which means that he is carrying 2 copies of the Desert Ghost gene. Of course he does have other genes in him. He is also pinstripe, pastel and leopard. But when you're working a recessive project, your base canvas is the recessive morph. So we're going to be working with Desert Ghost, and we're going to be adding other genes to the Desert Ghost morph to get what we want. So for now we're going to focus on just the Desert Ghost aspect, and we're going to talk about working with a recessive project, and we're going to talk first of all about Hets. So there we go, this is the Desert Ghost male that we were using, and we paired him to something which is not Desert Ghost, and I'll talk about why we did that, why we had to do that in a later episode. But for now, this is the male and he is Desert Ghost. And underneath the paper here is the female for the project, and she is a spot nose. She is not Desert Ghost, she is not carrying the recessive gene, she is not even Het for Desert Ghost. She is just a straight single gene spot nose, and I'm leaving her in a tub. I'm not going to pick her up because number 1 she's quite large, and number 2 she's crazy. So that's the female, and by pairing the Desert Ghost to this non-Desert Ghost we are creating the clutch that you just saw, which is all 100% Het for Desert Ghost. What exactly does that mean and how does it work? So in order to explain this, we're going to have to understand a little bit about genetics, and for this I'm going to enlist a little bit of help from Mr. DNA. Everybody remembers Jurassic Park and Mr. DNA, where they dug a mosquito out of a piece of amber, and that mosquito contained the DNA to recreate a dinosaur. Well, our snake also has DNA. Every living creature has DNA, and that contains the genetic code to make that particular animal, and it's always a double helix. So here is our male ball python, and using the Mr. DNA analogy, we have a genetic strand of DNA which makes up our male snake. Why is it in two halves, and why is that important? Well, it's one of the fundamental principles of sexual reproduction and how you get variation and adaptation in a species. This is our male snake, and when the male snake mates with a female snake, it produces sperm, and sperm contains only one half of the genetic material. So this double helix is split in half, and some of the sperm will get one half of the DNA, some of the sperm will get the other half of the DNA, and generally speaking both halves are identical, so it doesn't matter. And along comes female snake being in pink because it's female. When she makes her eggs, she also splits her genetic code in half, and again both halves are identical, so it doesn't really matter which half. So when daddy snake snuggles up to mummy snake, half of his DNA is recombined with half of the DNA from the female snake to recreate our new snake, which is half of what dad is and half of what mum is. Hopefully the best characteristics of both. But that is the fundamental principle of sexual reproduction. The offspring are half of mum and half of dad. Okay, so let's go back to our male ball python, and we're going to add a genetic modifier to this DNA. And a genetic modifier, or what's commonly called a gene, is actually like a bolt-on goodie. Along this strand of DNA are a number of locations, or loci, locus, addresses where these genes can reside, and each gene has a particular key to a particular spot on the genetic code. So for instance, desert ghost, here is the desert ghost gene, and it has a key to reside on that portion of the snake's genetic code. And you will notice that there are two halves to the genetic code, which means, yes, you are quite correct, there are actually two slots, and this is known as the allele. Each allele carries room for two genes. So this snake can have no copies of the gene, one copy of the gene, and in this case across the allele it is different, and so it is heterozygous. Hetero meaning different. So we have the het form of this genetic mutation, or this snake can carry two copies of that gene, and in this case across the allele is identical. We have the same genetic mutation on both sides of the allele, which is known as homozygous, or the same. Homo meaning the same. So let's take desert ghost as our base morph. Desert ghost, we know, is a recessive gene, and the more I work with ball python genetics, the more I am inclined to believe that dominant, incomplete dominant and recessive genes are actually part of a continuum. There is no reason to distinguish between them because they all work the same way, and I'm going to show you how that works now. But if we have, for instance, an incomplete dominant gene like pastel, the male carries one copy of pastel and there is a visual expression of pastel in that animal. It can also carry 2 copies of pastel, and this is known as the superform. In the case of an incomplete dominant, we refer to a superform, and it's carrying a copy of pastel on both sides of the allele that pastel resides at. This gives us the complete visual expression of pastel. So one copy gives us a visual expression of pastel, it's a bright coloured snake. 2 copies of pastel gives us a super pastel, which is even more blushed and even more pastel coloured. So we get the complete form of an incomplete dominant gene like pastel only when we have the super form. Likewise for desert ghost, which is known as a recessive gene, works exactly the same way. If a snake can be carrying no copies of desert ghost, in which case it's just a normal, it can carry 1 copy of desert ghost, the heterozygous form or het desert ghost. Because this is a recessive gene, the visual expression of the het form actually looks just like a normal. There is very little indication that the animal is het for desert ghost. The animal can also be carrying 2 copies of the gene, the superform or homozygous form of desert ghost, and this is where we see the visual expression. This snake will look like desert ghost. It has 2 copies, and this is Dad. He is a visual desert ghost. Forget the other genes for now. Let's just work with desert ghost because that's our base morph, and we're going to be adding other genes to desert ghost as part of this project, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. Let's understand first how recessive genes work and what hets are. So here is Dad. He is a visual desert ghost, 2 copies of the desert ghost gene, and here is Mum carrying no copies of the desert ghost gene. When they mate, the male splits his genetic material in half, and the offspring are going to receive 1/2 or the other. Remember, only half of the genetic material comes from each of the parents, and we recombine that in the offspring. And likewise, Mum does the same. She splits her genetic material in half. So, because we only have 2 halves of the male and 2 halves of the female, there are only 4 possible outcomes in the offspring. And this is where the Punnett square comes in, and the Punnett square is often represented as being something very, very complicated, and it's not. It's actually very, very simple. What we're saying is that for this particular combination, a desert ghost male and a non-desert ghost female, there are only 4 potential outcomes in the offspring. So let's do it. Let's see what those outcomes are using our Punnett square. So we can take this half of the male here, and that is carrying 1 copy of the desert ghost, and we compare it to this half of the female, which is carrying no copies of desert ghost. So that's 1 copy of desert ghost in that square. Or we compare the same half of the male to this half of the female, which is also carrying no copies of desert ghost. So when we recombine that to make the new baby snake, the new baby snake gets 1 copy of desert ghost. We take the other half of the male, we pair it to this half of the female and get 1 copy of desert ghost, or we pair it to this half of the female and get 1 copy of the desert ghost. Remember, there are only 4 possible outcomes, so all of the offspring are going to carry a single copy of desert ghost. What does that look like? All of the offspring will have just 1 single copy of desert ghost. So they will not look like desert ghosts. You will not know that they are desert ghosts from their visual appearance, but they are all het for desert ghost, and they are carrying 1 copy of the gene. That is what heterozygous or het means. So in this batch of babies, what we have done is created a whole clutch that is all Het for Desert Ghost. Before I go on and explain why, let's have a look at what we could potentially do with a Het. Let's say that we grow these babies up and we breed them back to each other. So we're going to breed sibling to sibling. We pick a male, we pick a female. They're both Het for Desert Ghost, and here they are. So here is a male that is Het for Desert Ghost, and here is a female that is Het for Desert Ghost. They're both carrying just one copy of the Desert Ghost gene. They are both Het for Desert Ghost. Let's pair them up. There are only 4 potential outcomes. Let's take this half of the male, which is not carrying a copy of Desert Ghost, and pair to this half of the female. She is carrying a copy of Desert Ghost on that side of the allele. So the baby receives 1 copy of Desert Ghost. We take the same half of the male and pair it to this half of the female, and this time this half of the female is not carrying a copy of Desert Ghost, neither is the male. So in this square here we get no copies of Desert Ghost. Let's take the other half of the male and we pair it to this half of the female, and now we're pairing to the half of the female that is carrying Desert Ghost. So this baby receives 2 copies of Desert Ghost. This is the homozygous form. This baby is going to be carrying 2 copies of the gene and is going to be a visual Desert Ghost. Let's take the same half of the male and finish off the 4 possible outcomes. We breed it to this half of the female, and so we get 1 copy from the male, no copies from the female. So in this square here we get another Het carrying 1 copy of the gene. So those are the 4 potential outcomes when you breed Het to Het. Let's take a look at what we've got. We've got 1 visual Desert Ghost carrying 2 copies of the gene, the homozygous form. We have 2 babies that are carrying 1 copy of the gene. These are Het for Desert Ghost, but they look like normals. And in this square here we have a baby that also looks like a normal but isn't carrying any copies of the gene. How do we distinguish which is which? 1 out of 4 of the babies is a visual Desert Ghost, so we know that's visual Desert Ghost. We can see that. So let's take that one out. So 1 out of every 4 babies statistically is going to be a visual Desert Ghost, and we can remove those. That leaves 3 out of 4 babies which look like normals. They're not visual Desert Ghosts. We don't know which is which. This one looks the same as this one, looks the same as this one. Unless there is some expression that the baby is carrying 1 copy of the gene, we would never know. So 3 remaining babies look like normals. 2 of the 3 are Het, and this is where we end up with possible Hets. The baby is either Het or it's not, we just don't know. So we use the statistical probability for the remaining babies that are not visuals, and we call them possible Hets. So in this case, 2 out of 3, that is 66%. 66% of the remaining babies will be Het, 33% are not. We just don't know which one. So these 3 normal looking babies we say are 66% possible Het for Desert Ghost. Note that the baby is either Het or it's not. There's no halfway house here. What we're talking about with pos Hets is the statistical likelihood that it is a Het, and we'll go on to prove, as we say in breeding terms, prove that it is Het for Desert Ghost and when it's paired with another animal carrying the desert ghost gene, we'll be able to produce visuals. This animal here that is not carrying the gene will not. So in our project, breeding het-to-het is not always a good idea, because number one, the result is only 1 in 4 visuals, but even worse, the remaining 3 out of 4 babies all look like normals, and only some of them are het for desert ghost, and we don't know which ones. A far better way of working with hets is to use a visual with your het. Let's do that. So in this particular case, what we're going to do is to take Dad, because he's a visual desert ghost, and we're going to be a little bit naughty and breed him back to one of his daughters. His daughters are het for desert ghost. They are carrying 1 copy. From a genetic standpoint, still only 4 possible outcomes, but it's going to be different this time. So let's work that. Let's work a visual desert ghost paired to a het for desert ghost. So we take this half of the father, which is carrying a copy of desert ghost, and pair it to this half of the female. 1 copy from the male, 1 copy from the female. This is a visual desert ghost. Let's pair the same half of the male to the other half of the female's DNA, which is not carrying the gene for desert ghost. So we get 1 copy from Dad, no copies from Mum. We take the other half of the male, and again we're going to pair this to each of the possible halves of the female. So we pair it to this half, which is carrying a copy of the gene, so we get 1 copy, 1 copy. 1 copy from Mum, 1 copy from Dad. This is a visual desert ghost. We take the same half of the male and pair it to the other half of the female, which is not desert ghost, and we get 1 copy. So the outcome when you breed a visual to a het, not only do you get 2 out of 4, or half of the babies are going to be visual desert ghosts, but the other half that are not desert ghosts are all going to be het. There is no doubt about it. Because father is a visual desert ghost, he must be passing on a copy of desert ghost to all the offspring. So we'll get 50% visual desert ghosts, and we'll get 50% of the babies will be het for desert ghost. A much more predictable outcome, much easier to work with. So that is heterozygous versus homozygous. That is what we're working with in this particular example, and I've shown you how working with hets we can control outcomes based upon what we pair them with. Now let's delve in a little bit more detail into the clutch that we just got and see how we can genetically engineer a solution to the problem that most of the babies that we got do not appear to have spot nose. Okay, so we've looked at what hets are, how they're made, and we've established some important genetic principles and probabilities moving forward that we can use in our project planning. So the takeaways from this episode are: breeding het to het gives you a 1 in 4 chance of producing visuals. Sometimes you'll get lucky and produce more than that. Sometimes you'll be not so lucky and produce less than that. Sometimes even none at all. We've introduced the concept of possible hets and what they are and how they're derived. In a het-to-het pairing, when you breed het-to-het, all the non-visuals are 66% possible hets. If you breed a het to something that is not carrying the gene at all, then all the offspring are going to be 50% possible het. We've also looked at breeding visuals to hets and how that doubles the probability that you will get visuals. So in the case of a visual to a het pairing, half of the offspring now will be visuals. And another advantage of pairing visual to het is that all the non-visuals will be het for the recessive gene. That can be a huge advantage in your projects because you know what you're dealing with, there is no uncertainty, and it means a whole lot less holdbacks because you know that everything is Het. You don't have to hold everything back and take a chance on whether they are Het or not. So it does make project planning a lot simpler. Moving forward, clutch 2 is shedding out, and we're going to take a look at those again. If you remember, I was unsure about what we'd actually got, and I think we've got a better idea now. We're going to use our newfound genetic knowledge to help us in planning that project moving forward. We're going to look at why you would create Hets, why this clutch was created, why that was necessary. We will introduce the other genes into the project. The male is also leopard lemon blast, so we'll use Mr. DNA and our pipe cleaners again to show you how that works, and it's very easy. You'll be doing this in your head. Very, very straightforward. We'll work out the probabilities and how you can work out the odds of any particular combination. So moving forward with this next clutch, we will look at what our options are, what we would want to pair to what in our existing collection, and we're going to plan out some of the options that we have with this clutch to arrive at our objective in the quickest possible time. So stay tuned for that. That'll be the next episode. I'm already in the process of filming that, so don't forget to share, like and subscribe and all that good stuff. And we'll see you next time.